Hi, I'm Karli Wurzelbacher, curator of the Heckscher Museum of Art, and of this exhibition, Amanda Valdez, Piecework. This exhibition includes paintings that span 2013 to 2019 and include different facets of the artist's work. In putting together the show, I was thinking about three big ideas that are contained in the term piecework. The first thing I considered was the way in which the artist pieces together, sometimes very literally, different materials.
For this specific piece, like all my pieces, they're sewn into the canvas. And once I then have that surface, I stretch it around the frame. And at that point is when there's kind of like a bit of a musical geometry that starts to happen. The lines start to shift and you feel the seam and the stitches being pulled, and then it's kind of sealed in that moment.
Looks different to me now than it did. But I still like these shapes together. Yeah.
And this is the moment where I brought in Oilstick. Actually, these two pieces were the first pieces I ever used Oilstick in the work. And so I actually had a visit with the curator when I was down at a residency in New Orleans at the Joan Mitchell Center. She had challenged me to try to find a texture that could compete with the embroidery. So I ruminated and thought about it for quite a while. And so that's where I kind of came upon the idea of mounting paper to the surface. I seal it all off. I use the Oilstick and go crazy. Always wondering, with all these materials, when they come together, what happens? Just as when we come into contact with the world, emotionally, psychologically, physically, what happens?
I like this arrangement, and I like. The second idea really concerned the way in which Valdez mines the history of art, spanning across place and time, and bringing those different ideas and traditions into her work.
Yeah, every now and again, like in a studio practice, you can definitely pinpoint these aha moments. And a big part of my practice for the last 10 years has been going away to artist residencies once a year. I was in Omaha, Nebraska at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts, and I went over for a day trip to the largest quilt museum in the United States.
Wow.
Which is the International Quilt Study Center and Museum. Coming in contact with quilts in a museum setting and studying them in that way gave me a moment where I said, okay, these quilt patterns can take the place of those big blocks of color, of fabric. And so it was in that moment that I decided to really start experimenting with quilts in the work. And I felt like it was part of the culture that, I am part of, and can therefore jump into being an author of it as well.
There's this undercurrent that runs through the history of painting and also quilting, that they share this common history, they influence one another, and then they diverge.
And I feel like even since I made this work, that sense of where one thing stops and the other thing starts, as far as how we've canonized those two practices, has completely been blown open. Everything from the Helma off Klempt show to the way that quilts continue to gain prominence in the understanding of design history and working with abstraction, again with the Geese Bend and kind of predating a lot of that early male European abstraction. Well, even when I started all this research, back in grad school a long time ago, I was looking at traditional stitch patterns, even before I made my way to quilting. I always had an appreciation for quilting, but I was even looking at how on the inside of our clothes, or even just within different histories of embroidery, that you had these ornate stitch patterns. And if you actually use them as image, they hold up against early abstraction. That in women's work, that sense of design has always been there, whether it's on the surface of a needlepoint, like a sampler where you're showing all the different patterns, or if it's hidden within clothes, all the different types of stitches and seams you can do.
the third idea contained in the word piecework is the way in which the artist brings pieces or shapes or forms together to interact in the composition.
Everything always starts from drawing. It's a very fundamental part of my practice. I think about it as a way to think through my hands, that we have all these experiences that are lodged in our body, and for me, by drawing, I'm dislodging them. But as far as, the shapes, I think another big influence in where they come from is that I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, that I grew up around large, irregular shapes and seeing geological time and the kind of line that nature makes throughout the earth. So I think that's another part of, the inherent psychology of me, which comes out in the inherent psychology of the work.
So I love how you're bringing together this ancient history with kind of a feminist bent, and then joining it to a more recent history of quilting, and kind of bringing those two things together.
There was this reoccurring image of a Phoenician goddess named Tanit, and she always kind of had her arms upraised, and she was kind of this bowl, this vessel, this mother figure. These drawings started to happen where there was this kind of this sense of holding something or bringing forth this base, and then a container.